Good afternoon and welcome to BizTech's ASEAN Midday Market Watch. Our guest today is David Kuo. He's the co-founder of the Smart Investor in Singapore. David, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Brian.
Now, David, there's been a lot of optimism about RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is seen as basically China taking the leadership role in trade and economic affairs in the region. You, however, have a less optimistic view. Now, could you share your contrarian view?
Well, it's not exactly contrarian, Brian. You only have to have a look at what is going on between China and Australia. I mean, these are both signatories to RCEP. And we have to point out that RCEP still hasn't been ratified by the various countries yet. So what we have at the moment is some kind of agreement. They've all signed on the dotted line and they say they like the idea. But ultimately, they haven't ratified them within their own parliaments. And I just wonder whether or not Australia is going to ratify this agreement. Because, I mean, ultimately, when you have a look at RCEP, they're talking about regional comprehensive cooperation, right? It is a pact between countries and between 3 of the North Asian countries and then 2 in the Southern Hemisphere. But which part of cooperation does China not fully understand? This is the part that I have trouble struggling with, because when you have a country such as Australia that expresses some concerns, particularly about the origins of the Wuhan virus, and then China takes exception to that and then slaps on 200% tariffs on Australian wines, you think, well, is Australia really going to be that keen to join RCEP? And when you have a look at China, any country that has a different view with regards to things like independence of Taiwan, the autonomy over in Hong Kong, freedom of the seas in the South China Seas, and maybe even questioning, you know, some of the human rights that they have in China. China just gets its back up, and then it suddenly says, right, if you carry on, or if you don't stop saying what you're going to say, we're going to punish you. And I just think, you know, that is not really cooperation. And it's certainly not a regional cooperation. So I have some doubts as to whether or not we are going to be able to see a ratification or a full ratification of RCEP. I mean, when I have a look at China, it reminds me of when I was a young boy and some rich kid invites you to his home. And China is the rich kid. I mean, China is the biggest of all the signatories towards RCEP. And China is the rich kid. So the rich kid invites you over to his home and he brings out his toys, but you're not allowed to play with it. All you can do is to sit there and watch him play his toys. Now, I mean, this can go on maybe 1 or 2 occasions. And on the 3rd occasion, you're going to say, you know what? I can't really be bothered to come over to your house to watch you play your toys anymore. And I think that is the problem. I mean, China should really be more magnanimous. China should be more benevolent. And it should be saying, yes, we are the biggest economy here. And there are going to be differences between us and the other signatories of RCEP. And so therefore, we'll listen to your concerns, but not just simply slap 200% tariffs on Australian wine. And it's not as though China has a wine industry of its own yet. Maybe one day it will, but it's certainly not up there with the French and the Italians and the Australians and the Spanish and even the American wines.
But I take a little bit of a different view there in terms of whether Australia will not ratify it, because the facts of the matter is the numbers don't lie. Australia's largest partner is China. It depends in many industries on China, whether it's the primary commodities, whether it's tourism, whether it's foreign investment into its property sector. So I think that China drug with Australia precludes any sort of a stance where Australia will take an overly strong stance against China. Now, in terms of your thoughts in terms of China being more magnanimous, yeah, perhaps. But I think overall, if you look at the RCEP equation, it's all about growing the pie. And if you look also on the underlying agreements, it's basically stitching together little bits of all the other agreements, and you're putting that one level up. It's not anything particularly new, David. So I think that that yes, there is optimism, but I don't share your pessimism on that side. I think this side, it's a lot more than just a divergence of views. It's also the fact that the punitive actions against Huawei in Australia, that has had that impact on, and that's what has incurred China's wrath. I think that's probably a little bit deeper than just the, I don't agree with what you're doing in Hong Kong story.
Well, I'll see your controversy, or rather your opposition to my views, and I'll raise it with TPP and also the recent news today that the UK is going to bring forward its ban on using Huawei equipment within the UK telecoms infrastructure. But ultimately, if America were to join TPP, I think that would actually change the whole dynamics of RCEP. In some ways, RCEP is a bit like, a poor relation to TPP. TPP is ultimately, the big agreement between all the countries within Asia, and then you go across the Pacific and over to the other side. So I think there is going to be a change, and it really depends on what is going to go on with the Biden administration and whether or not, Joe Biden will embrace TPP in the same way that America embraced it prior to Donald Trump. And if that were to change, I think maybe some of the people within, some of the countries within RCEP would say, given the choice between RCEP and TPP, I think I would take TPP any day. At the moment, we have TPP light, but if America were to join, then I think that would really change, the whole equation about how people will think about tariff-free trade between Asia and some of the countries across the other side of the Pacific.
And we'll hold on to that thought, David. We will know for sure probably from February next year. Yep. But let's go closer to home, and one of your articles this morning in your website lists 5 stocks on the SGX that have actually dividend yields of more than 5%. Now, in a low interest rate regime, that sounds really attractive. Walk us through some of these stocks and whether or not we should be holding them for the long term or just for the next couple of months.
Okay, well, the article was by Royston Yang, one of the analysts on our team. And I think what he was trying to suggest to readers is that here in Singapore, many people equate dividend investing with REITs. What they say is that, what else is there apart from REITs? And what he's trying to point out is that there are companies out there that have got reasonably high dividend yields in excess of 5% that are comparable to REITs. So don't just only look at REITs. REITs aren't the only fruit. And just as oranges aren't the only fruit, REITs aren't the only thing that you put into your portfolio. And the other thing about building a portfolio is that it is important to be diversified. Now, some people say, okay, so I am diversified. I've got 10 different REITs in my portfolio. That's diversification. It's not. And if you want to have a balanced portfolio, yes, by all means, have some REITs in there. And within those 5 suggestions, or those 5 companies that Royston talked about, one of them is a REIT. I mean, Fraser Logistic is one of the REITs. But he's saying that there is a world outside of REITs. And some of the companies, such as Valuetronics, it is a manufacturer here in Singapore. They do contract manufacturing, and it is a pretty strong company. It is not a REIT. Then you've got things like Sasori, which is a China-based REIT. So out of the 5, he's got a couple of REITs in there. He's also got Netlink Trust, which is a company that is involved in fiber optic laying here in Singapore. And then he's also got HRNet, which is a company that is involved in human resources. But I think the point behind what Royston was saying is that, yes, most people, when they focus on dividend investing, they look primarily at the dividend yield. And they say a high dividend yield is good, a low dividend yield is not good. But he's also saying to you, you have to look beneath the hood. You have to look at other things apart from just the dividend yield. So some of my favorite metrics when I look at companies is return on equity. How much of the shareholder funds is it converting into profit? And then how much of that profit is it retaining in the business, and how much of it is paying out? And when you have those two metrics, the ROE, in other words, the return on equity, and also the retention ratio, that gives you some idea as to how quickly that company can grow its dividends over time. So that is another two very important metrics apart from the dividend yield that you should be looking at. Another one, of course, is debt, because yes, by all means, it is great to have debt within a company, but you don't want excessive amounts of debt, because if you do, then it means that any of the profits that the company is generating, any of the cash flow, has to go off and pay the interest on the debt and eventually pay off the debt totally. So there are many things that you need to look at. And those are 5 companies that Royston has highlighted, and he considers them to be reasonable investments. And if people think that it fits into their portfolio, then by all means do so. Personally, I haven't got any of those 5 in my portfolio because they don't fit my philosophy of investing. And I am more consumer focused, and I'm also more property focused. So the only 2 that I would consider would be Sasur REIT and also Fraser Logistics. But the other 3, not at the moment, Brian. Maybe if I start another portfolio that is maybe more in line with things like human resources or some of the other issues, some manufacturing, for instance, then I might consider it, but not at the moment, Brian.
David, thank you very much for taking the time to be on the show. We've been speaking to David Kuo, the co-founder of the Smart Investor in Singapore, on BizTech's ASEAN Midday Market Watch. I'm Brian Fernandez. Check out www.biztech.asia for business and technology content.